So hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth installment of our speaker series, Reimagining the University, sponsored by the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition. I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU and co-director of the Center on Modernity in Transition.
I'm Benjamin Schewel, and together with Shahrzad, I direct COMIT. This series brings together leading thinkers to explore the historical foundations, contemporary patterns, and possible transformations of the modern research university. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Kristopher, Deondra Rose, and Zaloom to discuss the university and economic forces.
Kristopher Olds is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is co-editor of the book, Global Regionalisms and Higher Education, Projects, Processes, Politics. Deondra Rose is Associate Professor of Public Policy, Political Science, and History in the Sanford School at Duke University. She is the author of Citizens by Degree, Higher Education Policy and the Changing Gender Dynamics of American Citizenship. And Zaloom is Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. She is the author most recently of Indebted, How Families Make College Work at Any Cost, as well as founding editor of Public Books. Chris, Deondra, Kate, a very warm welcome to you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for joining. We like to begin these conversations on a more biographical note. So to start, I want to invite each of you first to tell us about some of the personal and intellectual experiences that led you to choose a career as a university academic. And second, to share with us a little bit about how your own experiences, whether personal or professional, have shaped your thinking about the current state of the modern university. Deondra, let's begin with you.
Thanks so much, Shahrzad and Ben. So excited to be with you all and to share the stage with Kate and Chris. So I was really lucky to be raised in a family that valued education. And I have to say my earliest memories are sitting in bed with my grandmother studying. So I was probably about 3, and she went back to school in her 40s to become a registered nurse. And so I have these memories of sitting with her on Saturday mornings, and she had these huge nursing texts, and I'd have my book, whatever it was upside down, and education was the cool thing to do. And so starting very early with the example that my grandmother set, I was the proud product of public schools, both in Ohio and in Georgia. When I determined that college was my next step, I went to a public land grant institution, the University of Georgia, and that was made possible by the Hope Scholarship in Georgia. It's a lottery-funded scholarship program. So for me and for my family, higher education was really essential to upward mobility in so many different ways. So I made it to college, and I realized that I was really preoccupied by questions related to how we get things done in society. So I wanted to understand, how do we decide that, something is a problem as opposed to a condition or a situation? When do we decide to take action, and who gets to decide what to do? How do we decide who gets the power to actually approach solutions? So I had all these questions swirling through, and I thought that I was going to become a lawyer, and that was going to be my pathway to delving into these questions. And I had a number of professors who said, Deondra, you might want to consider becoming an expert in public policy. And I really, I knew political science, but I didn't really have a lot of familiarity with public policy as a discipline. And so I decided to go to graduate school and to delve more deeply into those questions. And higher education was just this, as a political scientist, somebody who really cared about power, it was this really fascinating landscape. So for me, higher education is where it's at. It's where it's always been. And I think there's so many crucial questions. If you're interested in equity, if you're interested in how to get things done, I think education is a really important zone. So in terms of the second part of your question, the current state of higher ed in the modern university, as a political historian, I spend a lot of time thinking about the long arc of history and how higher educational institutions have played an important role in the development of our society. So I've thought of programs like Title IX and Pell Grants and even investments in institutions like historically Black colleges, and thinking through the role that those institutions and those policies have played in our progress as a society. And so I think to my mind, the modern university is one of the most powerful tools that we have to address equity issues. I think at this moment, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later in the conversation, we're at a moment of, I think, inflection in our political and historical life, where we're thinking seriously about what it means to be a democracy, about questions of equity, about questions of justice. And I think that the modern university is really one of the most powerful tools in our kit to address those kinds of questions.
Thanks, Deondra. And yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of those themes in this conversation. Kate, what about you?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for asking this question. And Deondra, I loved hearing your stories. I'm looking forward to hearing what Chris has to say too, because of course, higher education is so important to so many of our families. And that is true for me as well. I like to say that I am only a possible human being because of the University of Michigan, where my parents met. So my dad is the child of a Syrian immigrant. My mother grew up in Kentucky, and her father, I mean, at that point was also working in Michigan. Like, what other kind of institution where could it be possible where these two people would ever meet? Except in the Modern Research University, and so they did meet, and I am their child. But it actually started well before that with my family, because my mother's father was a boy from rural Kentucky who made his way to the University of Kentucky as an undergraduate, and then on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and eventually became an agricultural economist. As many rural boys did, as a kind of pathway into academia. So the significance of the research university was just totally profound for my family, and so I think that like with Deondra, it was always the kind of background for my interest as a researcher. But unlike my grandfather, who became an agricultural economist, I decided to go into cultural anthropology, and my major motivation for doing this was being able to work with lots of different kinds of people and to always start my research from their perspective. That was really essential to me, because I could see that the way that we came to understand what problems there were in the world oftentimes took place from the perspective of researchers who basically sat in their offices. And what anthropology did for me was to offer me a way to go out and to talk to people who are really confronting the big problems in the world, and to ask them what they thought was the issue. So not to presume that I already knew. And so anthropology was really essential to that. So when you bring those two elements together, kind of my interest in higher education and this anthropological perspective, it really became clear that higher ed was a major problem facing so many Americans, particularly Americans who'd already made it into the middle class or who were aspiring to upward mobility. And in the last 30 years, as I'm sure we will discuss, more later on, this has become one of the central problems of their lives. How are we going to pay for this education for our children? And that it was wrapped up not only in the kind of brute economics of how are we going to pay, but really how are we going to honor the obligations to the next generation. So paying is never from an anthropological perspective, really only about the money. It's really about using money to honor obligations, and higher education is really central to middle class and aspiring family life.
It's really interesting. Thanks, Kate. Chris.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's lovely to see everybody and hear everybody. My sort of angle in here is similar but different. I'm now, of course, based at UW-Madison, but I was basically a first-gen kid. I had no idea really about the universities in my city, except the close one, SFU, where we used to go watch cheap movies. And I ended up, and I fell basically into university. I don't even remember applying. This is the late 70s. This is sort of the second decade of massification, when Canadian universities were growing and expanding. New universities were being established. And so really at that time, I needed a C+ average, which I had to get in. Now to get into UBC, it's probably a 97 to 99% average. And sort of fell in there and had no idea that it was a good university whatsoever. I almost got kicked out, ended up realizing I should not be an engineer, and then ended up in the social sciences and got inspired at that time by faculty. They happened to have a lot of really good, inspiring faculty who just captured my imagination. So that was really fun. Created my own sort of internship related experiences, because we didn't do internships back then. So I just volunteered in the downtown east side in Carnegie Center, which is the most poor census district in all of Canada, and learned a lot in relationship to that. I got sort of inspired by all of this, but I was also incentivized. At that time, you could pay for your university. So I worked in the fish canning industry and mining industries. So you could work in the summer, and that would pay for all of the other 9 months of the year. So you didn't have any debt. That shows you what has changed in relationship to that. And then so was incentivized by also the hard work of working up north in the fishing industry. I used to have a picture of a packing boat which had 100,000 pounds of salmon, and I'm in gear unloading it by hand. We did 100,000 pounds in the morning, 100,000 pounds in the afternoon, and I had that above my desk, and I realized I did not want to do that for the rest of my life. University life was much more amenable. Let's just sort of put it that way. But the experiences that sort of shaped me with respect to understanding of higher education, being an international student, makes a big difference to helping understand what you take to be normal is actually not normal. Every place is different. I'm an economic geographer. I studied the globalization of the services industries, initially architecture and property, and then started to realize when I was in Singapore that higher education was being constructed into a global industry. It was being thought of from frameworks, for example, like the WTO, trade and services, commercial presence. So I was in Singapore when all of a sudden, post-Asian economic crisis, new university campuses were being established. They opened up territory to commercial presence, and they shifted regulations. And so that was fascinating to all of a sudden see Johns Hopkins and INSEAD in Southeast Asia. And then a lot of administrative experience now in the College of Letters and Science and Curriculum Committee. I've been doing a variety of things related to international education, educational innovation, curriculum restructuring, and then most recently I was working closely with our chancellor, who sadly passed away, Becky Blank, in relationship to revenue diversification, revenue innovation, trying to help us withstand some of the austerity-related budgets that were coming down the pipeline and will continue to come down the pipeline. And then finally, my own understanding, again, moving around, thinking about the press of politics on higher education institutions, UBC, undergrad, right when Thatcher and Reagan, I'm dating myself, were in power, and then budgets got pushed through, and there were no endowments, right? So what did universities do? And so we started to feel that as students. That was when, for example, international fees were differentiated for the very first time. Before it was free, or basically the same price to be an international student at UBC And now it is a major revenue generator and a heavy subsidizer of everything that goes on at that university. UK, with respect to managerialism, bibliometrics, national lurching systems of higher education. Singapore, experiencing actually soft authoritarianism for the in-person is interesting. I could talk more about that later. And then the US, and in particular, the Scott Walker era, right? And thinking about austerity and what that means related to budgets, but also the battle over mission, the battle over language, which we see going on right now. In many ways, we were the canary in the coal mine, you see, when you look at Georgia, Florida, et cetera. But we withstood that, so good.
Thanks so much for these incredibly stimulating responses. So moving now into the meat of our conversation, we'll start with what in many ways is the most obvious question on the theme of university and economic forces, which is the remarkably high cost of higher education in the United States. So the cost of a college degree in the US has gone up by roughly 180% since 1980. It gets even more dizzy the further back you go. The average cost of attendance for a student living on campus at a public 4-year in-state institution is roughly $25,000 per year. Meanwhile, by 2014, Germany had abolished tuition and fees for undergraduate students at all public universities, a practice that's also common in many other Scandinavian, Northern European countries. So why, from your perspective, have American public universities in particular become so expensive? And what does this tell us about the contemporary university, both as a product of economic forces and as an economic actor in its own right? Chris, you were already beginning to delve into this, so perhaps you can continue and share your perspectives.
Okay, I'll try to keep it brief here. So good, important question. I sort of talked a little bit about austerity, and yes, that's, I think, a key factor in force. We're now, for example, in my institution, down to about 12% of the budget comes from the state, even though 100% of the power politics is shaped by the state and legislators. Michigan was mentioned. I think it's now around 5% is from the state. Penn State is in and around 5% as well, coming from the state, with no necessary, again, correlation with respect to the easing up of pressure on them by public bodies and legislators and so on. So austerity, definitely an issue. I think one interesting thing about the US, and I had no idea until I moved to the US, was tuition differentials by out of state versus in state. It's quite uncommon in most places to have that kind of thing. I kept wondering, well, they're all US citizens. Why is somebody from Illinois paying so much more than somebody from Wisconsin? And there's reciprocity agreements, but that is a big differentiator, and it's become even more significant. And you see, for example, students from California going to big Midwest institutions because they're being pushed out of California because of the lack of capacity there to take them on, and they're starting to pay those tuition differentials, and they're being viewed as revenue sources. I'll come back to the sort of Germany issue, but I would say some other things, and I think internally about our institutions, that our institutions play a much bigger, more expansive, multifold role. We have many more roles and responsibilities, for example, compared to German institutions. Housing, for example. One of the head EUA, European University Association officials, was commenting when he visited our campus just how much housing there is, how many student services there are. Of course, they just rented houses and flats, I should say, in Berlin. So we take on board housing, and we're investing vast amounts of money in related to and housing. And that's even more, for example, liberal arts colleges. Ancillary services, student advising, student support, and IT, TA support, for example. When I was in Singapore, there were no TAs. The faculty were the TAs. There's actually vast amounts of TA support, which we pay for and we should be paying for. And so there's a variety of things related to that. Compared to England, for example, our graduate students, we subsidize them, we fund them. In England, you are a revenue generator as a graduate student. And so it's much more expensive, but it's expensive for us to provide graduate education support as well. And that indirectly comes through, for example, tuition fees and so on. Salaries and fringe benefits are relatively high in the US. Just think about healthcare. It's something that, it's just not an issue in many places. Universities do not have to cover healthcare, et cetera, and so on. So I think basically a wide array of responsibilities, roles and responsibilities, things that U.S. universities take on board and increasingly have to because of austerity and so on. I just want to make one comment about the Germany thing. It was an interesting thing. I just remembered that Alex Usher, a higher education consultant in Toronto, did a blog actually when that German issue came by, and he had an interesting point. He's comparing not the US but Canada to Germany. He said in 2014, their expenditure, he saw that, of course, the value in that, but their expenditure on higher education is half of what they expend in Canada. It's about $10,000 in Canada, in Germany, and about $15,000 per institution, per person per institution. Faculty in Germany get about 60% of what faculty in Canada get with respect to their salaries. And so their participation rates are much lower. They don't have the capacity to massify the way we do. It's a much more exclusive system. And so it is more affordable, but it's very much more exclusive. And so that is one of the trade-off challenges, I think, that Germany is grappling with. So I'll stop there.
Deondra, could you share some perspective on the question, why are American universities so expensive?
This is a fascinating question for me. And it's interesting because I spend a lot of time thinking about how we help people afford college, but not as much time thinking about why it's so expensive. So this was fun for me to sort of sit and think about at length. I would echo everything Chris just said. And to my mind, something I would also point to as a driver is the fact that since the 1970s, we've seen a dramatic increase in socioeconomic inequality in the United States. So with this rising gap between the haves and the have-nots, many people have turned to education as a reliable mechanism for securing economic stability and economic mobility. So we've seen that, for many people, and you hear people say this all the time, a high school diploma is no longer a safeguard against economic insecurity. Increasingly, we need higher education, college degrees in order to reach the middle class. So I think there's a premium on higher education, and something that has sort of supported and undergirded this is the fact that federal financial aid programs have actually created additional funding sources. So not only are the costs increasing, but students can afford to pay it. And I say afford loosely, because in many cases we see there's so much student loan debt that students and their families are grappling with right now, but people are increasingly comfortable with borrowing money to pay for their college degrees. And so we've seen in recent decades a really dramatic shift away from grant support in terms of federal financial aid support and state level support toward student loans, both public and private. So I think, we actually see a public policy feedback effect that is at play here that's actually contributing to these rising costs. The other thing I would underscore, and this echoes a lot of what Chris said, is that, higher ed is very much a market. And colleges and universities increasingly compete for students. And so, there's an incentive to make sure that your college or university has the best faculty, it's producing the best research, it has the best facilities, it has the best dining and athletic, what do we call them? Quads or courts. I mean, it's really quite elaborate what a number of institutions are doing in order to attract students to their campuses. So to my mind, there are a number of forces at play here. Something else I would say, I spend a lot of time thinking about questions of equity. And I would just underscore that there has long been a tight connection between the economy and higher education. And so even when we think about how colleges and universities get the various sources of revenue that come through their doors. So for me, I think a lot about the fact that a number of sources, for example, philanthropy, investments of endowment income, a number of those things are tied to the market and how well people do in the economy. And you might even think about, of course, families that are investing, as Kate said, in higher education because they're really thinking through the long-term stability and success of their kids. So I think, the economic driver and sort of rationale of pursuing and investing in higher education is really central to everything we're talking about. And I think because of that, to my mind, one of the biggest challenges we have in higher education is not only recognizing that our job in many cases is to contribute to the development of workers, people who can go and find gainful employment in the economy, but also thinking through the other responsibilities that we have in higher education. So to my mind, that includes working to foster the development of citizens more broadly. So I know pretty sure we'll talk about that a little later in the conversation as well, but I also just want to emphasize that this economic motive and driver is so strong and so central to everything that we do, and in many ways creates some interesting competition when we think about our responsibilities.
Thanks, Deondra. So, Caitlin, you note in your most recent book that the reasons for the rising cost of U.S. higher education are hotly debated. There are different interpretations, different explanations. But you also remind us that free public education used to exist in the United States. So why, from your perspective, is public education, university education, so expensive in the United States now?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and it's been very interesting to hear the other responses. And I'm completely in agreement with everything Chris and Deondra have said. I would add that we have to think about the idea that universities need to be an economic engine and what that does to our reasoning. And to do that, we might think back to the 1990s, actually. So I was a graduate student in the University of California, Berkeley, and so I went back and looked up the data for Berkeley, and in the 1990s, Berkeley was getting about 50% of its revenue from the state. And today it gets about 14% of its revenue from the state. So there's clearly a shift away from an idea that the state has responsibility to its citizens to provide a pathway for higher education. That has really decreased on the part of California. And there was a kind of a philosophical shift that justified this that I want to point to, which is a shift from understanding higher education as a public good to a private benefit. So when we say that something is a public good, it means that we have to understand that educating in this case Californians to contribute to California in many different kinds of ways. Economically is one of the kinds of ways, but that is only one, right? Also, like Deondra said, as citizens, as members of community, as members of family, as people who can think forward to producing new kinds of futures, which California has always been identified with, for better or worse. That those were values on which considering higher education as a public good was founded. But in the 1990s, there was a real kind of shift from understanding higher education as a public good to understanding education as a private benefit, which meant that that the funding of higher education could be cut from state legislature budgets and shifted onto the shoulders of the students who would, in this rationale, and it's empirically true, earn more once they got a higher degree. Right? But that was the justification for cutting state budgets. It was actually that the students themselves would benefit, so that in fact they should take on debt. rather than the universities being subsidized directly by the state. And that's actually an enormous, that's a philosophical shift that has enormous implications. So I think that we're at a moment now where we can kind of reconsider what universities are for, and these kinds of discussions are very much part of that.
Thank you, Chris. Did you want to chime in?
Sure, and I don't want to make it get depressing, but it was interesting to go through the Walker eras in Wisconsin, and a lot of the discourse was related to this shift and the cut of budgets was also related to a perception, a perceived perception, a perception and a communications that we were bloated institutions made up of lazy faculty. And therefore, and then also people who harnessed slush funds, and terms like that were used. And so a lot of the cuts were rationalized in relationship to that, versus sometimes that there will be private beneficiaries, the students, i.e. the future workers. And so that was the sort of the start of a lot of these culture war related battles about tenure, about mission, etc. But it was amazing how much that is an additional component that is extreme in the US, I would say, compared to lots of other countries. And it's something distinct and unique, and universities aren't always kitted out to battle about these things.
Well, picking up on some of the points that you've all raised already, Kate, I was struck by some of the parallels between your first book, Out of the Pits, which is an ethnography of financial markets and the traders who operate within them, and your most recent book, Indebted, which investigates how the financial pressures of paying for college affect American middle-class families. Both of these books speak to the values and ideals and ethical codes that are embedded in our systems of economic exchange. Financial markets, of course, are largely built on the ideal or the value of competition. So in that context, competition is thought not only to result in the right outcome, for instance, the true price of some good or the right distribution of resources, but it's also supposed to shape a particular kind of person, specifically a person who is well equipped to compete in the market. Interestingly, I think the university is also seen as a shaper of people. And increasingly, it's seen as an institution that shapes people, again, to compete in the economic marketplace. Now, of course, many people, including many who study and teach in universities, understand higher education to be promoting different ideals and different objectives. So I want to ask you to speak to the various values that inform the operation of the contemporary university. What do you see as the most powerful of these values and cultural beliefs? And what values should be shaping higher education from your perspective?
Yes, this tension between the idea of the university as shaping people who will be workers and competitive in labor markets versus other kinds of values is incredibly important in contemporary universities. But it is also the case that it's been a central problem in universities at least back to the beginning of the 20th century, when the philosopher John Dewey was writing and trying to resist the idea that education generally was for training workers and therefore should be in effect subjugated to the demands of the corporate sector, right? So the thing that he was trying to say was that actually, no, we shouldn't be educating students so that they become today's workers. It's incredibly short-sighted. And I mean, in his day, when he's thinking about younger children being educated, like those jobs may not even exist. So like, what are we really doing? He was asking then. And it's exactly the same kind of question that we should be asking now. I mean, I also, tend to think about the kinds of people who need to be shaped at higher education institutions in similar kinds of terms. Higher education institutions are for creating people who can shape a new kind of future, right? We're an evolving democracy, and we're even in an evolving economy. Things change incredibly fast. The kinds of people that we need to shape as educators are people who are prepared to deal with that kind of change. And when we do that, we will be preparing workers, sure, but we will also be preparing citizens and like members of local communities and of our national and global communities who can take us forward and even who can innovate when we need them. And so, of course, that's what I think that is the best thing that we can possibly do as educators. And it's actually not in contradiction with an economic way of thinking about what universities do as far as shaping people goes. It is consonant with that, but it does challenge who should be in control. And that's the political issue. Because if current corporations and their current needs are who should be in control, then universities need to serve them, right? But if it's young people who are going to be in control, then we as educators need to serve them. And I am very committed to that second view.
Chris, I want to put the same questions to you, but perhaps through a more international lens. In your work, you look, for instance, at how Pacific Asian cities and countries such as Singapore, for example, significantly deepened their linkages with foreign, mostly Western universities at the turn of the 21st century. And they did this largely driven by the logic of economic competitiveness. In other words, with the objective of enabling their future generations to better compete in a globalized marketplace. What goals and values are universities across different regions of the world from your perspective? And do you think they're the right ones?
Question, a difficult one to answer. I'll sort of try to take a cut at this. Hopefully I can raise some questions we're sort of thinking about. So I guess that's it. I'll start with the Singapore one. You flagged it. It's an interesting one. Right, it was a colonial outpost. It was set up. They set up national universities to mainly provide labor. They sent their the children of the people with power overseas. Initially, Oxbridge came, and England. Later on to the U.S. To places like Stanford and MIT, and it's broadly changed and transitioned to try to find ways to use the higher ed system to support their transition to a so-called knowledge-based economy, but one where they can also attract attention. And so there's a whole big branding component to this. So there's a capacity building component and capacity building logic, which is one of the key things that they initially really drove and focused on. And competition too. They brought in foreign universities to try to generate and destabilize basically national institutions. Treat your faculty better. They treated us like government civil servants when I was there, for example, and very quickly that transitioned. To broaden it out though, our former university chancellor, David Ward, a historical geographer who was also the president of the American Council of Education, was talking with me and a variety of other people about some of these big transitions. And so what I would, and this will echo what Kate said and Deondra mentioned earlier as well, is he sort of suggested that it's worth sort of thinking about this shift from universities and higher education playing a more of a cultural political function and role, initially focused on elites, later citizenship, social development, and so on. And this is a little bit more in the pre-massification era, and then even later on during the massification era in North America, towards a more political economic function, right? In the development of skilled labor, in the development of university industry linkages, so-called innovation districts, innovation systems, all these catchwords and buzz phrases, but basically the university being harnessed offering to be harnessed, but also being asked to harness themselves to helping develop regional economies and national economies and so on. And then higher education itself being viewed as an export engine, right? In Australia, it generates as much, it's the third or fourth largest export earner in and around where coal is. In Canada, it is a major export earner. The US as well, it generates, I believe there was some Financial Times story just the other day that it generates far more than many other sectors in the UK. And they forget about that in the context of all these debates about Brexit and so on. And so it's a major export earner and so on. And it's really as well increasingly wrapped up with branding, right, in this so-called attention economy and an attempt to brand territories, cities, states, entire countries as innovative knowledge-based economies. So I would sort of say it's worth sort of thinking about that. There's a lot of countries and systems, the ones that I know better, are all shifting in this direction for good and for bad. And then there's big, though, variability depending on, for example, if you've got a national system, right? If you've got a national system and you can do things like national research assessment exercises or research evaluation framework kind of exercises in some countries, then it's easy to lever change and push systems, push higher education institutions in that way than in others. The same goes with respect to the use of, for example, bibliometrics to govern what faculty do, right? To focus this attention on citations, citation indices, H indexes, all these things that drive and govern faculty is often a big danger to academic freedom, but it's easier to do that in a national system. The US, for good and for bad, it doesn't really have a higher ed system. It's a mess of complicated systems and so on. And so I would say that it's worth thinking about these structural forces, but thinking about as well the variable capacity to maneuver amidst these structural forces. And what matters to me, I would say, is institutional autonomy. Kate just mentioned that, and control, thinking about shared governance and the capacity of, for example, faculty, students, staff, administrators to work on and grapple with these issues together rather than being driven by top-down senior administrators. And then for good and for bad, I think having greater independence, revenue diversification, greater differentiation of flows that enable you to be more autonomous from strong top-down state-driven political agendas in the US at least is really important.
Thanks, Chris. Deondra, the relationship between higher education and competitiveness features prominently in your work as well, competitiveness both at the individual level and at the national level. But you also center, as you mentioned before, the broader goal or the broader value of citizenship as an important product of university education. Your book makes the case that certain landmark higher education policies enacted in the US in the mid-20th century significantly expanded women's access to college degrees. And as a result, women gained the skills and the opportunities not only to compete in the labor market, but also to participate much more fully in civic life. As you put it, higher education enabled women to fulfill their roles as citizens. Do you see citizenship and its cultivation as guiding ideals, let's say, in today's university? And more importantly, insofar as it's a value in higher education, what do you think the ideal of citizenship should entail?
I love this question. I mean, I absolutely think that the responsibility to help foster thoughtful, critical thinking, engaged citizenship should be one of the priorities of higher educational institutions. I think it's, to my mind, one of the most valuable and important contributions that higher ed institutions can make to our current landscape. I think it's one of the most valuable and important contributions that it's made to our landscape historically. Like even just looking over the long arc of American political development, for example, there's so many instances in which, as I mentioned, or as I discussed in my book Citizens by Degree, that programs like Pell Grants and Title IX have really helped women to not only increase their educational attainment, but to move more fully into their roles as citizens. So we've seen women vote at higher rates. We've seen them contact elected officials at higher rates. They've contributed more money to politicians and to causes they care about. They've even thrown their hats into the political ring at higher rates. And so this has been fostered and supported by the knowledge and skills that women have gained in higher ed institutions, by the networks that they've developed over the years, and so many other benefits they've gleaned. To my mind, sometimes asking about the economic benefits of higher education and forgetting to also attend to the civic benefits and the significance of higher ed for the development of citizens has really, it's led us to do, I think, serious disservice to marginalized communities historically. So, it's interesting. I spend a lot of time thinking about the people who actually aren't served by higher ed institutions or haven't been at particular moments when we were leaning into the economic interests of higher ed. As Kate said earlier, when talking about control, like really thinking about who has the power, and I would say analogously, whose interests are prioritized, has always been something that shaped how higher education has worked and the extent to which it has supported in some cases, I would say suppressed in others, citizenship and well-being in other domains for certain groups. So to my mind, a great example of how education has sort of worked in tandem with economic interests is the GI Bill, 1944 education policy. So World War II veterans coming back to the US were offered unprecedented support for pursuing college degrees. And this policy, many people recognize as helping to create the modern middle class, helped to create pathways to education for so many low-income Americans of that greatest generation who probably would not have considered going to college. But what's interesting is that, that there was a very clear economic impetus for supporting the GI Bill and passing it, and that was to make sure that returning veterans didn't flood the labor market. Another example of this close connection between economic interests or certain economic interests in our education policy in the US has been how we've thought about funding public educational access, both K through 12 and higher ed for Black Americans. So there were some interesting instances, especially during the Jim Crow era, of lawmakers hesitating to extend higher ed support for Black citizens because there were planters and other agricultural professionals, especially in southern states, who needed to have a set of people, particularly children and women and young people who were available to work in fields. And so for that reason, there was some hesitation and some slowness to support a number of efforts that could have really targeted and increased higher ed support for Black communities. So to my mind, we always have to ask, how are our higher ed policies, how are our higher ed institutions providing pathways into them for those who've been traditionally and historically excluded? So I think at this particular moment, our current moment, and we've talked a lot about the rising cost of higher education, the biggest question to my mind is, how do we ensure that higher education is affordable for everybody? How do we ensure that higher education is of high quality for everyone? And so, to my mind, making sure that we're providing pathways to socioeconomic stability and opportunity is crucial. And then, as we've been talking about, just the tools that help people to engage as citizens. So helping us to, goodness knows, with our social media landscape, helping us to think critically and to review critically what we're seeing posted on Twitter, what we're reading in terms of, now that we're seeing AI tools that are producing really, really sophisticated pieces of writing and articles, we need to make sure that we're investing in a citizenry that can actually engage with these new developments in a way that's effective and that they're empowered to do so. So I think, to my mind, in 2023, higher education is more important than ever. I think the needs of our citizenry are more important than ever. And to my mind, the big question is whether higher ed institutions are up to the task of really reimagining what we're doing and what our jobs are, and really centering the civic mission, I think, in that.
Kate, go
Caitlin?
ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add on one thing to what Deondra just said, or just to extend it a little bit even farther, which is to say that inside universities, we also have to make sure that students have the range of possibilities that fits that fits their passions and what they want to do. So, and oftentimes that is in conflict with the demands of raising money from donors and from private sources, which is what public universities have to do. So, for instance, at the University of California, Berkeley, again, just invested $500 million, partially, or in large part also from donor funds, in a new data sciences center. At the same time that they are proposing, they have decided to close down the anthropology library, which cost them $400,000 a year. Okay. I mean, the disparities here are huge, and now the undergraduate population of the anthropology department is largely Black and brown, whereas the data sciences center, as you might imagine, is not going to serve that same population. So I think that the way that we have universities structured economically can also really restrict the options for students who want to serve as citizens in different ways, as well as economically in different ways as well.
So the cultivation of social cohesion across difference, whether this difference be related to gender, race, class, ideology, religion, nationality, is a significant challenge, both on university campuses and in our societies at large. So as each of your lines of research explore, these dimensions of diversity carry with them economic implications, many of which further complicate the challenge of social cohesion and solidarity. So I'd like to ask you to each talk about how the university can help address these social divisions, but also just to highlight some of the tensions that emerge. So Caitlin, for example, in your book, you describe how middle-class families go to great lengths to pay for college because they believe higher education will ensure for their children quote unquote open future, as you put it. That is a future in which young adults can make themselves into the people they want to be, free from pre-existing strictures of social hierarchy. But paradoxically, our current debt finance system of paying for college creates or maintains many of those unequal strictures that they're trying to escape. So how can higher education and the university at large become sources of social solidarity, sources of this open future that young people aspire to create rather than its opposite?
I mean, this is such an important question. So one thing that I want to emphasize about student debt is the way that it kind of comes into our classrooms in a way that is quite hidden, but which is also really, really important. So based on the amount of debt students are taking on and the sort of weights that their education is costing each of their families, their stakes in education are really, really different. I mean, and I see this, very strongly at NYU, at the private university where I work now. I mean, where there are like very wealthy students, and there are students who are on full aid, and there are lots of students who take on lots of debt to be there. So this variety of kind of economic stakes that students take on has an impact on what students feel like is important and what they bring to the classroom, what they feel like they can do. Like one challenge that I see in my classroom all the time is that students are now working really, really hard and incredibly long hours in order to be able to contribute to their education and help their families make the commitment that's required of them, for instance. So in a lot of ways, these are the kinds of stratifications that impact on what our classrooms can do, and also on the kinds of solidarities that students can build among each other during classroom hours and after. I mean, and I think here the importance of after is actually probably like the greatest amount. So the thing that I think that would be more important than anything is that getting back to a system of essentially free tuition for everyone would create an opportunity to find solidarity among really quite unlike people. So, for instance, sometimes when I say this, the objection is that, well, then you're going to pay millionaires to go to college. But I actually think that creating an institution where the millionaires and the students who come from low income backgrounds are experiencing the institution in a similar way would actually be really, really important. And in fact, if our taxation system worked in the way that it should, which would be redistributive, and the families of those wealthy students paid a decent rate, it could be redistributed to a higher education too, so that higher education could do what it is supposed to do, what it can do, which is to create a citizenry that can operate across difference, that can find solidarities across difference, and flattening the economic field among students, I think, is really essential to that.
So Deondra, I want to pose the same question to you, but turning now to the role of historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, which are the subject of your most recent research. So you have a recent article about the Second Morrill Land Grant Act of 1890, which provided federal resources to support the creation of 19 Black land-grant colleges. So you argue that this legislation was the product of a politically expedient compromise between Northern radical Republicans, who actually supported greater educational access for Black citizens, and Southern Democrats, who wished to expand federally funded higher educational opportunities in the region generally, while also maintaining a segregated racial order of Southern educational institutions. So further complicating the story is the fact that in relation to indigenous land, the Morrill Land Grant Acts were some of the most dispossessive in U.S. history, expropriating millions of acres of land from indigenous nations. So in light of these complicated and even paradoxical histories, how do you see the relationship between the contemporary university and the current challenge of social solidarity?
Thank you for this question, Ben. And can I do a shameless plug? I finally finished the manuscript. So it's called The Power of Black Excellence, HBCUs and the Fight for American Democracy. And it's currently being considered by Oxford University Press. And, this project was especially sobering because it really underscored the complexity of how the U.S. has used higher education policy, or failed to use higher education policy, to promote equal opportunity, full citizenship for various groups. As you say, this history of higher education is a complex one. And to my mind, when you think of like you mentioned, like the land dispossession, I could also point to this trend during the Jim Crow era, whereby some Southern states would actually give basically like scholarships to Black students who are pursuing graduate degrees to travel out of the South, like into another Northern state, to pursue a PhD or a master's degree, as opposed to integrating the state university. And we're talking public institutions that were supported by the tax dollars of all citizens, regardless of their racial or ethnic background. So to my mind, higher education institutions have actually been complicit in the challenges and creating the challenges that we have, especially when we think about equity and equal opportunity. And I think that higher ed institutions have a responsibility to help address those inequalities and that legacy. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the role that colleges and universities have played and should play currently in helping us to become a more unified society. And goodness knows, we have some deep fissures, and we see those. I'm sure all of us could talk about that, that what we're seeing, not only in our classrooms, but when we're hearing just the discourse about higher education. As a political scientist, I spend a lot of time thinking about the contemporary political discourse. I mean, I was reading something recently just talking about partisanship, and we know that people, in the 1950s, people were pretty much okay with the idea that their kid, their son or daughter or child would marry someone who identified with a different political party. People are much less excited about that prospect today. And that's just one example of the fact that we are increasingly drawing deep lines between ourselves and others. Social media, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think helps a whole lot, or at least we haven't found ways to, I think on a broad scale, redeem social media, or to really be more intentional in how we're using it in working against the division that it can oftentimes exacerbate. So I spend a lot of time as the director of the Center for Politics at Duke thinking through how our institution can be intentional in fostering community and how we can really make the most of our higher ed mission to help us to better know each other. I think that's part of it. I think we're increasingly atomized. I think there are fewer opportunities to get to know each other aside from or away from the stereotypes that we're often fed in various media sources. I think that there are organizations who do this really well in terms of providing tools and resources for having generative conversations across differences. So we've teamed up with organizations like Braver Angels up in New York, and they are pros at providing sort of lightly moderated debates on pretty spicy topics that help young people in colleges to feel comfortable delving into the difficult topics, asking tough questions, and actually not personalizing disagreement or a lack of agreement on things. I do think increasingly, I should say this, I don't know that higher education, in thinking through our curricula, I don't know that we're embracing the topics and challenges that we ought to be today. So one of them is actually helping young people know how to dissent, helping people understand that sometimes disagreement is okay, and you can disagree and you can still be friends, or you can still, enjoy people's company if they feel differently from you. I think that in some cases, where we recognize that dissent and talking across differences is valuable, sometimes we jump into those conversations without bringing in the pros, and maybe we wing it. And I honestly don't think that's the way to do it, because for various members of our community, delving into tough conversations around social issues, political issues, economic issues, and so forth, oftentimes we have different levels of risk when it comes to engaging in that work. And so, to my mind, we have to take this topic of building social solidarity and engaging with each other as seriously as we do other academic disciplines. To my mind, we would not admit students into a rigorous mathematics program without doing some sort of prerequisite training and assessment. And we wouldn't expect for someone to graduate from a degree program without being able to demonstrate proficiency in some of those areas that we think are especially important. Yet I don't know that we're actually holding our students to any particular set of expectations when it comes to engaging in difficult conversations or conversations across differences. So I really think that this question is part and parcel of the value and significance of higher education today in 2023. And I think that for us to make the most of what higher education can do in terms of benefiting and supporting a strong society, I think that'll require some really, really careful, intentional thought and programming on our part.
Thank you so much. So Chris, in your editorial work on the blog Global Higher Ed, which you created in 2007, I believe, you've tracked trends in higher education across the world. For instance, in 2017, you documented how the United States, as well as several European countries, expressed concern over the attempt by the government of Hungary to control the Central European University. There you have the case of a state government using Modern University, a research university, to promote nationalist social cohesion against the threat or the presumed threat of a certain kind of diversity. So what does that case and others like it tell us about the power and potential of a genuinely open university to promote the kind of social solidarity that we're talking about here, which is to say solidarity that includes and promotes diversity?
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a really interesting case, and I would say it's worth looking back upon. Eventually they were pushed out by the PM, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, and others. So it was a very strong, deft, actually, attack to reduce institutional autonomy, not just with respect to Central European University, which was actually a private, not-for-profit, relatively independent institution. They still managed to push it out using a variety of regulatory and legal moves, and it's now in Vienna. And it was a strong battle, but it's actually worth looking back upon because you can see echoes of it with respect to what's happening in some U.S. states, including Florida right now. And so this drive to promote sort of nationalist social cohesion against what is perceived to be a problematic kind of difference is, like I say, worth thinking about. And I would reinforce the fact that in this case, the Central European University, it was relatively autonomous and independent. It was supported by the European Union. It was supported by regional institutions like the European University Association. It was supported by embassies throughout Hungary as well, and they still managed to push them out. So I think there's a couple of lessons, and there are, again, echoes in relationship to this, that basically, if you see these kinds of moves and agendas, and I'll focus more narrowly than Deondra did with respect to this particular topic, that there is a couple of lessons that are worth thinking about. I think the main one is once targeted by powerful politicians, that higher education institutions and their leaders, faculty organizations, student organizations, etc., have to be ready to stand up and speak for themselves, to defend themselves, and actually shed light on the unfolding of these conflicts in the governance process. So CEU was led by a former politician, for good and for bad, the leader of the once Liberal Party of Canada, Michael Ignatieff, and was used to robust debate, was a good spokesperson, and was engaged in a lot of dialogue, debate, discussion. They used, and I knew the communications people for the university very well, they used the communication systems to basically, again, shed light on exactly what was happening, why this was problematic, and blow it up basically into a big international issue. There's debates whether that helped or not, and that would be the same goes with respect to the US. Does actually shedding light on this generate more blowback and more pain rather than just sort of acquiescing and so on? I think it's sort of worth thinking about. It's worth thinking, though, that and comparing to, for example, Inside Higher Ed on 30th of March had a story. The title was "The Silence of Florida's Presidents." And Inside Higher Ed, the outlet asked 40 public college presidents in Florida to weigh in on state higher education reforms. None of these 40 presidents were willing to speak even when offered anonymity. And so there's something going on in relationship to this kind of content, and it's counterintuitive on some levels. You're talking about the U.S. You're not talking about a formal authoritarian sort of context. And then second, and I'm going to keep this brief, but it does, I think, tie in with respect to what Deondra was speaking about. And I think this social solidarity that we're talking about can be worked on by the higher education sector in our own universities, regardless of the noise, regardless of these discourses, et cetera, that swirl around us. I think there's a lot, and this is blown up by social media, a lot of rhetoric where it's actually seems like it actually is worse than it really is if you're in the trenches and you're engaged in curriculum reform, you're engaged in dialogue and discussion. And I would emphasize that it's really even more important to take part in university governance processes as you think about curricular structures, the future of general education in many different institutions. You can engage in lots of different dialogues and discussions, even if you are forced to be pushing out some formal DEI agendas and initiatives. You can still do all of this. This is just the way our institutions work. We're really hard to actually govern, and we're hard to govern from our own perspective, but from the outside as well. So I may be overly optimistic, but I think there's a variety of things that can be done to promote diversity, to support and protect it. We just had, for example, a 3-hour discussion last week, a retreat on DEI initiatives and how to implement them, to move them forward, to make them more successful, to redress some of the weaknesses as we've dealt with them over the last couple of years. It was a fun, genuinely fun, laughter-filled 3 hours to grapple with these kinds of things. And so we got a variety of initiatives to move forward on. And so I would encourage us to think about governance, to do what we want to do, and to push forward these value systems very importantly. From the outside, for example, and then you can also adopt the Singapore approach when you're getting criticized, and it's basically say yes and do what you want. So I say yes and do what we want.
Thanks, Chris. So we have about 20 minutes left, and we'd like to get to 2 questions if we can. The first one pertains to the notion of public knowledge in the context of the modern university. This is a theme or an idea that spans really a wide variety of questions, from those about universal access to online educational resources to more philosophical questions about the democratization of knowledge. For instance, what is the nature of knowledge? Who should generate it? To whom does it belong? And you've all been attentive to this theme in different ways. Chris, you were involved in the creation of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's open educational resource strategy, which offers freely accessible online resources for learning and research. Kate, you're a founding editor, as we mentioned, of the online magazine Public Books, which, as its website puts it, brings together academics with other public scholars, critics, and activists to make the life of the mind a public good. You and I are also part of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, which is, of course, a sponsor of this series. And Deondra, as you mentioned, you direct Polis, the Center for Politics at Duke, which also has a public-facing orientation. So I want to ask each of you the following questions. When we say that knowledge should be public, what does that statement mean to you? And what implications does it hold for the contemporary university? Deondra, let's start with you.
Thanks so much, Shahrzad. So here at Duke, we talk a lot about knowledge in the service of society. And so to my mind, when I think about public knowledge, I think of a commitment to a multi-step intellectual process that doesn't just stop at knowledge creation or discovery. So it means to me that after you've done your deep analysis and research, you've run your survey or you've done your experiments, that you then step back and think about the value of that knowledge to a broader set of constituents beyond, say, your academic discipline or your colleagues. So that might mean that you could find ways to make your research legible to and accessible to other communities. So one of the hats that I love wearing, and that I've an organization that I've been involved with for, I'd say nearly 9 years now, is the Scholar Strategy Network. And Scholar Strategy Network is committed to connecting researchers and policymakers, and doing all of this translation that we're talking about. And I think the overall objective is to help support the creation of quote unquote good public policy, evidence-informed public policy. But to my mind, there are so many different pathways to making our knowledge and our contributions, our scholarly contributions, useful publicly. And I love, Shahrzad, you mentioned just the value of like thinking about higher ed institutions as like pathways for access to knowledge and understanding. So thinking through just the reach of our institutions and working to provide access to the public, I think that's crucial. To my mind, there are ways that policymakers can actually provide a sounding board or information to policymakers and other issue advocates as they're thinking through big questions or how to solve problems. So I think, to my mind, it's really thinking about our work as not simply or not solely generating knowledge or insights, but really working to connect those insights with, whoever, whatever institution might be able to apply them.
Right. Chris, we'll go to you next.
Sure. I'll focus more narrowly on open educational resources. So what does this mean to me? Basically, and OERs are more teaching and learning oriented open educational products that are produced to share knowledge. So they're purposefully created to be public, accessible, freely and legally shareable, and reusable. For example, Creative Commons, which is the licensing structure and system, defines them to be in the public domain, licensed in a manner that provides everybody with free and perpetual permission to engage in the 5 R's of retaining, remixing, revising, reusing, and redistributing the resources. And so there's a legal foundation, and I think this is quite important as we try to find ways to share and produce knowledge and make education more affordable, for example, for students. I think the implication of this is, and this was what you asked as well, is you can, yes, have strategies. And one of our problems, though, and I help create the strategy, is strategies don't matter unless you actually implement them. You make these agendas realizable, you fund them, you prioritize them, you profile them, etc. And there's a variety of things that can be done. We can talk about this maybe later on. I don't want to use all the time up, but I think it needs to be realized. You can be principled, but if you can't realize it, then it doesn't actually really in the end matter.
Kate, how do you approach the notion of public knowledge?
I approach it in 2 different but related ways. I mean, first, perhaps comes from my instincts as an anthropologist, which is to say that the public part of public knowledge for me begins with how I decide what I'm going to work on and how I'm going to work on it, right? Which is always in engagement with the people who I'm working with to generate the knowledge. So for me, the first step in creating public knowledge is to engage the public in the construction of the research. So I mean, like for my book Indebted, to actually kind of listen to the people who are facing the challenges of paying for higher education, and to center their concerns and their histories in the work that I'm doing, so that even once I've published it, there's a kind of natural pathway back into the lives and a certain kind of relevance for the people who are represented in the book and people who are like them, and for Indebted, that meant, basically middle class and aspiring Americans who are trying to send their kids to school. In other words, I mean, millions and millions of Americans. So by trying to bring the public in at the point of designing the research is really important for me and for anthropologists and for lots of other scholars as well. So I like to highlight that part of what we might we might think of public scholarship. And then, of course, there's kind of the dissemination end of it too, which is about kind of creating new kinds of publics or new kinds of public spaces. And that's how I understand public books. Public books is a place where public scholars can gather. And by public scholars, I don't only mean those of us with PhDs and jobs in the universities, but anyone who is engaged in deep and sustained reflection on knowledge and desire to create new kinds of knowledge. So, oftentimes the very kinds of people that I'm working with in my own research. It's a place for public scholars of a variety of histories to kind of gather together and think about ideas. And so each of our essays in public books is designed to be accessible to a wide range of people. It's challenging. All of our essays are very challenging, but they're also written and edited in a way so that lots of different kinds of people can find a point of entry and a point of engagement within any idea that we present.
So we normally begin our conversations on a biographical note and then try to end them with a question that our speakers will say is unfair. So I think we're going to continue with that spirit. We want to turn to the question of the future and the task of reimagining the university, which is the overall theme of this series. So we'd like to invite you to free your imaginations and consider what a university could be. Caitlin, you've called on the U.S. government to provide students with a right to the future, meaning, quote, the freedom and capacity to live full, decent lives and pursue their own interests without debts that tie them to inequities and errors of the past. Quite interestingly, you've also described this right as, quote, a claim to the possibility of a generational reinvention. So this is obviously a profound departure from the status quo today. So given the particular challenges and crises that our societies currently face, for all speakers, what kind of futures should the modern research university strive to create? In what ways would this university itself need to be reimagined in order to build those futures? For example, what kinds of knowledge would this reimagined university produce? What kinds of methodologies would it employ? What kinds of people and persons would its educational processes give rise to? What would be its relationships to the immediate community and environment in which it's situated, the land on which it sits? And what would be its relationship to our planet, to humanity as a whole? So paint us a picture, if you will, of what a reimagined university could be. So Chris, we'll start with you in light of your current comment on feasibility being the main qualifier for proposals of reform.
Just to make a couple of very quick comments because we have 8 minutes to answer this significant question. So if I had the capacity to reimagine a university, I'm an incrementalist and somewhat pragmatic, I would sort of basically draw upon experiences and successes. For example, the one that I worked at now, and which I actually love working for, where you balance, and it's hardly perfect though, academic freedom, shared governance, relatively flat hierarchies, public service, and enhancing access, but really focusing on internationalizing, especially with respect to teaching and learning, taking advantage of the COVID lessons learned about digitalization and all these new technological developments to really open up the teaching and learning space, to collaborate, to cooperate, to have shared projects, shared courses, and have wealthy and well-resourced and experienced institutions create resources for other institutions that are challenged, maybe perhaps fiscally, perhaps in partnership with them. So I really focus on internationalization with respect to teaching and learning. And then I would focus as well on really trying to ground our institutions in the cities, the city regions in which they are operating in and they are embedded in and often actually quite separated away from. And this is everything from internationalization at home, which really helps deal with the fetishization of student mobility, greater public service, opening up campus, even community facilities, mixed uses, making sure we're really open and embedded and we support our university communities, our cities in our regions. And then much more respectful and action-oriented attempt to redress what we talked about, actually, the First Nations, moving beyond performative land acknowledgements. If I hear any more land acknowledgements, I'm going to pull my hair out unless they tell me what are they going to do, actually, besides make a land acknowledgement. And I got more to say, but I'll stop.
Thanks, Chris. So Caitlin, we'll turn to you.
I love this question, and I also love that I don't think that I personally am responsible for reimagining the university. I want my students to be doing that. And so what I see as my responsibility is to help students kind of realize their own capacities to do that reimagining. That's what I want. That's how I see universities moving forward, and I think that is how our society is going to move forward. And the young people who are in college today, they certainly have a lot on their plate. They need to they need to fix climate change. They need to fix the racial disparities, particularly in the U.S. They need to fix our global situations. There are a lot of really big problems that these young people need to face. And what I see as my job is helping them be able to imagine something different. So I think that's really essential. Now, doing that also means enabling them to move forward without the kinds of weights, the debt weights that previous students have had to face, particularly over the last 30, 40 years. And I also want to highlight a couple of wins in this regard as well. Like, for instance, the Biden administration, I feel like this isn't as widely known as it should be, has canceled $66 billion in student debt. That's without the $10,000 or $20,000 for borrowers globally that is currently on the table. He's already canceled $66 billion in student debt. That's a win. The Biden administration is also reimagining how students will pay for college going forward by reforming our totally broken and honestly internationally very strange system to be more in line with a well, I won't go down this road too much, but like a very rational income-driven repayment program that is quite similar to what Australians already have. So there is movement here. There is possibilities to kind of free up students to do what I would like them to do, which is to be able to reimagine the university and our society more broadly.
All right, Deondra, we'll give you the final word.
Well, I love everything that Chris and Kate have said. I think my reimagined university would be one that really prioritizes democracy and investing in citizens. And I also think I would vote to completely overhaul and disrupt how we think of the timeline of higher education. So to my mind, 4 years or 2 years aren't enough. I think we're going to have to really start thinking of higher ed as a lifelong endeavor and find ways that provide pathways into higher ed institutions for everyone. So I think there's a lot of exclusivity about higher ed because of timing, and some people, because of various responsibilities, don't have the opportunity to pursue higher education, and it's not modular. We're not taking advantage of the ability to meet people where they are. So I think I would really work to completely shake up how we do higher education, how we model it. And then I would say really, to my mind, higher education at its best is one that invests in its local communities and all of the communities of which it's a part. And so I think, historically Black colleges provide a really powerful example of a set of institutions that have done this really well historically. And I think, and we know this from a wide range of higher ed institutions, but I think that there's so many powerful contributions that higher ed can make and has made. And so I think that really centering our communities should be crucial and central to it.
Deondra Rose, Chris Olds, Kate Zaloom, just a terrific conversation on a hugely important topic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next and final event in this series will take place on Friday, June 30th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, when Miguel Altieri and Risha Kumar will discuss local knowledge, global change. That event is also part of a series on rural transformations, co-sponsored by the Duke Center for International Development, and it will be in the able hands of other moderators. So Ben and I want to take the chance now to thank all the speakers whose deep thinking and openness to dialogue have so greatly enriched our conversations on reimagining the university. We'd also like to thank the three sponsors of the series for their vital support: the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition. And of course, many thanks to all of you for joining us. We hope you'll tune in again on June 30th, and we wish you all a safe, happy, and healthy summer. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.